next day or two. To kick things off, first, thank you all for joining, and I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Lisa Wager, who has over 20 years of experience in talent management, employee engagement, and leadership development. She's worked across multiple organizations and industries from technology, manufacturing, healthcare, and professional services, to name a few, and continues to contribute work to enrich the industry through research, innovation, and best practices in our field, particularly as more organizations are committed to leveraging workforce analytics and artificial intelligence platforms. Lisa has a wealth of experience, particularly when it comes to leadership assessment, development, as well as 360. So please join me in welcoming Lisa as she shares her valuable expertise with us today. Thank you. And Lisa, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, James. And thank you all for joining today. I'm excited to share with you just an understanding of 360 feedback and how, the application of the 360 feedback, how it has indeed been evolving quite a bit, and how it can be a lot more actionable and impactful for our organizations. So bear with me for a second. What we will talk about today is just the various uses. So kind of getting to the basics and understanding what's 360 for, but also what are the trends that we're seeing in terms of how it's being applied and how it can have this greater impact and influence, not just on individuals, but on organizations as a whole. Next, we'll be talking a lot about how that impact can really amplify results when 360 feedback is coupled with our broader listening program. So think employee engagement surveys or various pulse information that comes through that informs not only the developmental components for a leader, but also how that leader can impact the team as well. And then lastly, kind of coming down to why, why do we do 360s in the first place, as well as why would we propose to align those with other, key informative components for the organization, and what value does that provide? So first and foremost, 360 feedback, it's been around for a long time. And what it can really essentially provide, not just, again, for the individual, but first and foremost, it provides that self-awareness. So taking a step back here and thinking about what 360 feedback is, it's really an opportunity for individuals to understand how they're showing up in the eyes of others. So think about this in the capacity of whether they're senior leaders, executives, middle management, frontline leaders, or even aspiring leaders. These individuals can get some sort of opportunity of understanding how are my direct reports, how are my team members, how are my customers even, various perceptions of how they're seen in comparison to how they're viewing themselves. So that self-awareness is so valuable that it does provide insight, and not just my strengths as well as opportunities, but potential blind spots that I may not necessarily be aware of. And in this, with 360 feedback, it of course is designed to really inform that developmental guidance. So not just provide that awareness, but also help us understand, where are my gaps in terms of how I want to develop, what my goals are, and the context of my role, what I need to do moving forward in order to really be a high-performing individual for the organization. And with that, it lends to those next steps of making sure that we're focusing in on the right things. Developing action plans that are centered around some of those opportunities, as well as blind spots that can, again, move us in the right direction for an individual. But 360 feedback also has some real key values for the organization as well. Looking at the feedback as a whole, it can reveal specific talent gaps or even learning gaps. So when organizations are thinking about how do we want to invest into our employees, where should we be focusing in on different learning assets, or even our high potentials? This type of information, when looked from an aggregate perspective, can really provide those essential insights that can lend itself to learning and development planning. It also can help to identify as well as build that leader bench strength. We always look at 360 feedback as really being focused, if we're doing the right thing, focused on development only. But it also can help to not just identify where those talent gaps might be, but also understand where are our high potentials and how do we get them to the next level. So it really is truly about providing self-awareness, helping us isolate those things where we can be the best, And then creating that action plan that, again, isn't a one-time thing, but there's that continuous follow-up. But we know as the workforce is evolving, as we think about the future of work, even as James has alluded to, everything that's going to be impacted or has already been impacted by AI and different technology factors, the 360 feedback assessment and how it's being applied and how it's even, or what it's even measuring is really evolving. So not only are we doing all of the things that we focus in on in terms of gaining self-awareness or understanding what our blind spots might be, but it can help us to develop in those core areas. And when I say core areas, it isn't just about what are our leadership success competencies for my organization, what are those things I need to focus in on, but also what do we need to measure and understand as it relates to the culture itself. And of course, 360 will provide that personalized development. But what we find these days is with the access to greater technology, as these components become a little easier to be able to gain that feedback, there's this continuous feedback loop that can take place. So where traditionally we will see 360s being done on potentially an annual basis or even on an on-demand basis, oftentimes, or in these days, we can and have seen organizations set this up in a way that's done quarterly, for example. So teams giving continuous upward feedback to their managers in order for that manager to get an understanding of how they're progressing on their action plans, but also still understanding what other things can they focus in on. AI, of course, advanced analytics are a key component to this too. It's not just the standard, hey, here's my feedback, but as you can see, information can come in from all different sources to help inform, again, where should I be focusing in on and how am I progressing? And of course, we know managers have taken on not just themselves working remotely in some cases or hybrid, but they have these teams. So people are working differently. So new emphasis here is understanding how do we engage? How do we create this sense of team if we have our employees working in multiple sites? And with that, we know that the workload, this emphasis on well-being is really critical. Double down even if we have a team we aren't necessarily seeing every single day. So that emphasis on well-being, as well as we've seen that shift in retention going from the great resignation a few years back. Now we're seeing this quiet quitting or detachment from the organizations. Employees aren't necessarily leaving, but they may not necessarily be engaged. So a lot more for our managers to tackle. And that really comes down to this last point is moving from this individualized focus, or I should say still centering around the individualized focus of development, but tacking on the influence that a manager can have on the culture and engagement of their employees. As we've seen as far as trending for both manager effectiveness as well as engagement, year over year, as you can see from 2019 where we are today, we've seen this pattern where, of course, manager effectiveness has stayed fairly steady, but we're seeing that slight uptick. But since the pandemic, we're seeing engagement going the other direction. It's coming back down to normal levels, but it's a real huge point here to say that it's notable that managers are seeing that elevated level of manager effectiveness, whereas engagement may be going in the other direction. So this really highlights that there's a big opportunity here. Managers have a real unique opportunity in that they are not just taking from their upline in terms of directives and cascading information, but they're also on that front line in terms of executing and engaging their teams. If we can close this gap between our manager effectiveness and really leverage managers as a way of engaging our employees, this is key and critical to how we can lend itself toward becoming a higher performing organization. And with this, as we think about those broader listening programs, and again, thinking about employee engagement, for example, as organizations, as they are also experiencing that trending in terms of their engagement levels, kind of trickling downward, different from where they might have been in the last couple years. Of course, they look at those things that are driving engagement forward. And with that, just the simple strategy of looking at what's driving engagement, what are we going to focus on as an organization, and what are some key actions that we're going to do that will cascade enterprise-wide. and we're on the hook for that for the organization as a whole, but managers also need to think about their team specifically as well. But we find a lot of these action planning maneuvers centered around that broader listening program and employee feedback that's really tapping into their relationship with the organization and their work. It can provide some real value in giving us some very focused and prescriptive actions that we can take, but those do tend to be pretty process oriented. They have to be fairly structured for us to roll this out across the organization, and it can have an extremely strong impact on organizations in terms of performance, engagement, and all of the other key factors that we're measuring. But what it doesn't have is guidance specific for managers. So I may be a manager who has a key action that's coming from the organization as a whole, and I may be willing to execute that, but do I really know how to? So with these kind of broader listening programs, we may have minimal guidance for managers. In addition, we don't have necessarily that development component. So the behavior change, the awareness of how my strengths as a leader are really going to play into these actions that we need to roll out. And one other thing to mention is, yes, we're seeing manager effectiveness staying fairly strong, but we also know that there's a lot on these managers' shoulders. Again, they're in that pinch between what other leaders are asking of them and how they're engaging their teams to actually do it. So, in one sense, this could be adding on an additional task versus what we propose as part of this 360 feedback edition is an enriching opportunity for them to develop further and make these actions a part of their day-to-day. So looking at those top drivers of engagement from our study from 2024, it is really centered around leadership and vision, communication and team, recognition and value, growth and opportunity. And as we think about those themes, yes, we can see directly how frontline managers, when working with their teams, can affect each and every one of these components. From recognition and being able to give those pats on the back, as well as growth and opportunities, having those developmental conversations. But I know just from experience and through talking with various leaders, we can talk about these actions that we want to, we know are going to impact engagement in a positive way. But I have seen leaders go in and do exactly what we've said to do, that we know will impact engagement. So for example, motivating your employees, get them excited about the vision, really show that you value them. All of those things can take place, but I've even seen in one instance where after they've done all the things they needed to do, then turn around and just discredit it by saying one or two things that, or even their behavior may take away from that. So it becomes ingenuine. And the real point here is that, yes, we want to continue on that broad organizational actions, but if we can have some focused leadership development that are centered around these particular drivers, we can really amplify those actions and the impact that it has to create a high-performing culture. One example of this, again, is leadership, trust, and vision. So just thinking about that particular theme itself, some of those organizational actions, they're going to center around communication, town halls, spotlight various teams and what they're doing, or even just sharing our results, sharing our scorecard. So some of those broader sort of process-oriented actions that take place. But when that comes down to the manager actually taking on those actions, you can see that it really is how critical it is that that information is cascaded forward. In a study that we did looking at pre to post-pandemic levels, we saw that just trust, for example, there was a distinct difference between senior leadership trust and immediate supervisor manager trust. So how do we bridge that gap? It's really about making sure that our managers, if we are centering around this action of leadership, trust, and vision, they're able to champion and inspire around that vision. They're creating an open and very clear goals, recognizing employees' contributions and aligning us to that goals and directions. But the big question is, how do we do that? If we tell each and every manager, this is what you need to do, how do they do it? What are their strengths? How do they play into this? And what do they need to develop? This is where that 360 can be so critical and important and informative to help those leaders not just understand themselves in the context of these things that we know are going to impact engagement in such an important way, but also, give them some sort of perspective on how they can develop further and grow. because it's just one snippet here. It's so important. Trust alone, thinking about trust alone and how it impacts engagement. If we can have both senior leaders as well as managers hitting on all cylinders with one of these, you can see those that trust their leaders are 11 times more likely to be engaged than those that do not have confidence or feel their leaders care. That's powerful. That's impactful. And as you will see, this really ties back to organizational performance. So posing out a couple of things here, of course, we focus in on those items that, again, are going to just be the basics in terms of how a manager leads, leadership effectiveness centering around how I'm best able to enable and equip my employees. But if we can center around behaviors that are focused on engaging our talent and above and beyond just, these essentials of high performance leadership, we can isolate those key things that I, as a leader, know that I may have some challenges or have some opportunities in, or even some blind spots. We might even discover that we have some unknown strengths that we can leverage even further as part of that 360. So understanding some of these core competencies aligned with our broader listening program will really help to get laser focused in terms of what a leader can focus in on and amplify those results. So some of the benefits that we've talked a little bit about along the way of aligning our 360 feedback programs to our broader listening strategy is, first and foremost, it helps to prioritize what should my developmental actions be. Oftentimes when I'm in a debrief session with individuals who have 360 feedback results, there may be some obvious challenges here and there, but it really takes a strong discussion to think through, what do I need to focus in on? It's always one of the primary questions. Understanding what my team's challenges are, in addition to understanding what my strengths and opportunities are, can again really focus in on those things that are going to make the greatest difference. It can also have a great benefit to me personally as a leader to understand my strengths and opportunities, but also think about those team benefits. So I'm not only developing in my core competencies, but everything that I'm focusing in on is going to directly tie back to the challenges that my team's experiencing every day, as well as engagement. And then it will facilitate this feedback culture. So, we oftentimes talk about some of the challenges that are related to not just getting people to participate in surveys, but also 360 feedback and making sure we have some variation and a safe place to be able to provide feedback. Having this as part of that broader listening strategy can, again, help to reinforce this open, transparent, kind of growth-minded type of culture. And then, of course, measurement and progress. This is another way that I can look at, how am I progressing as a leader? How am I impacting my team? And we've focused so much on engagement and why it's so important, of course. It all starts with the leader. And as you can see, our most effective leaders compared to those that are falling much below, ineffective leaders, there is this huge differentiation between their engagement levels. So those most effective leaders, or those that are reporting that their leaders are extremely effective, their engagement levels at 91%, compared to those that are saying their leaders are not as effective, 17%. So think about that difference that's really in play here in terms of how leaders directly influence that employee experience on a day-to-day basis. What we're expecting of our leaders daily, even as they roll out these action plans and are engaging employees, and how we can enable them further to be more effective. Because ultimately we know engagement ties back to all of our key performance indicators at the end of the day. So yes, we're focused on creating a positive work environment and a positive experience for our employees, but we know if they do feel engaged, it affects gross profit margin, net profit margin, earnings per share, and even how our brand, our Glassdoor ratings. So to extreme levels in some cases. So just a couple other things. I know we're a little bit at time here, but looking at some just additional tips, kind of taking, again, back to the basics, keep it simple. So as you are aligned with your 360 feedback programs, or even helping individuals with their own development, keep it simple, focus on just one or two areas for development, making sure that we're creating those SMART goals, making sure they're specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and timely. But above and beyond that, just having that feedback, an opportunity for a debrief session or even a coaching or even an internal mentor that we have has seen and been so much more impactful than just handing over a document or giving an individual link to look at their results. So understanding those results and having a conversation about where we do next with this, making sure that we're aligned with our manager in terms of what our priorities should be, and we're getting that support from our managers as well. There's additional tips here, making sure we're integrating if there are those organizational learning assets, as well as quarterly checks, measures of progress. This is never a one-time event. Growth and development is continuous through life. So, setting the goal, fitting, understanding what we're measuring in terms of progress and continuing that loop forward. And then, of course, just as I talked about, aligning with not just our leadership success profiles to make sure that we're measuring the things that are relevant and important for what I'm doing today, but also extending it out to those broader employee listening programs and feedback. All right, so I guess I will open this to any questions that may come up. Otherwise, if there aren't any, well, if there are questions, let me know, but I will mention that as part of our learning series going into 2025, we will have, starting in February, some new sessions coming up. So make sure that you check out our workforce science website to see what's on the docket and on the calendar for 2025.
And Lisa, we do have one question before we go. The question is, when do we use coaching versus 360s? And then a follow-up, what are some of the good tools for 360 assessment?
Yeah, yep. So coaching versus 360. Um, Honestly, I have found that the two work really well hand in hand. Or, if it's not 360, having some sort of other assessment, as in those coaching opportunities, being able to have some sort of additional objective measure of the individual that you're working with to really facilitate that conversation, kind of isolate some of those strengths, even if it's a 360, again, getting into that self-awareness. So whether it's another assessment or 360, I think there's a great deal of opportunity if you can have both of those coupled together. I will say, just to extend on that, where I have seen maybe coaching take place, above and beyond, the broader understanding of my different competencies and so forth, is if individuals have specific needs. So for example, if I know that communication is something that I want to work on, that can be really isolated in terms of that coaching aspect, or if there's various challenges. But without digressing too much, I would say the optimal opportunity is to combine coaching with an assessment, whether it be 360 or another leadership assessment. And as far as some of the good tools for 360 assessments, I know, not to pitch, but Qualtrics has an amazing 360 platform that you can use. So that being the platform, they do have an extensive library in terms of the different content that you can use for measurement that hopefully will be centered around, a specific validated competency model. Excuse me. We also see some other, options out there. Of course, I presented a competency model that WSA uses often that integrates just the individual development as well as, opportunities to engage talent.
Thanks, Lisa. Don't have any other questions at the moment, it looks like. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time. Please do reach out if you have any other questions. But as Lisa highlighted, look for our next learning session, which will be in February after the new year. And hopefully, you've taken some insight and some value out of Lisa's presentation here today on 360s. So, thank you all and have a wonderful and merry holiday and new year. Thank you.
Thank you.